This is the Ramana Maharshi Self-Knowledge Satsang, a time for self-reflection and self-inquiry. Know yourself and be always free and at peace. Welcome. I'm Richard Clarke, and I'm hosting this satsang. I'm a seeker like you, sharing what we love. I've been blessed with years of deep teaching, and I bring this to you with this satsang. The background image today is the entrance to Ramana Ashram. We were here hundreds of times during our years living near Arunachala. We would often take meals there and have our lunch sitting on the floor with 100 other people. We would sit and meditate in the old hall. We would go into the new hall and walk around Ramana's samadhis with our minds turned within. We would go to Mother's shrine and walk around it. We would meet people who wanted to meet with me, and we'd meet them at the afternoon tea. We would walk through the ashram on our way up the hill to Skandhan Ashram or onto the start of the inner path. Here are some photos that we took. This is the entrance to the ashram. This was taken early in the morning and not many people were there. This is the parking lot. The parking lot is empty except for my motor scooter. Often you would see peacocks. They strut around and make their loud call. This is the new hall again in the morning. There are not many people there. In the morning, they do a very nice puja to Ramana's shrine. And after they're through with the puja, then they bring out a fire and people gather around it and take the light. Here is the camphor flame. There are boys from the Brahmin preschool that's on site there. They live at the school and spend their days learning the details of being a Hindu priest. After they have got Ramana prepared for the day, they put up a curtain and then take the curtain down and offer another puja to it. The people in the ashram stand and pay their respects to Ramana's samadhi. At 11 o'clock, they have each day a poor feeding. And this giving out of food is something that I think is important to the folks at the ashram. They really have been offering food to people who came there since Mother joined Ramana about 1915. So they've been doing it for 100 years. And this poor feeding is actually so important to them that even though the ashram now is closed to all visitors because of the pandemic, they still are doing this poor feeding. I guess they're doing it outside the ashram somewhere. We would go for lunch and be served lunch on a banana leaf. like what you see there, a rice and sambar and another dish or two. And we would sit on the floor and eat with all the people who are there. The attendants would walk back and forth, bringing us things for our plate and serving us. Nobody would eat until everybody was served. This is Arunachala from the ashram. This is a fairly famous view, and you'll find it in many photos. This is Ramana's Samadhi Hall. This is where he lay down and gave darshan to many thousands of people as he was dying from cancer. He wanted to make sure during this process that he didn't deprive those people who came from so far for the chance to see him. So he made himself available all the time. This is the old hall. This is where Ramana sat and meditated and sometimes answered questions. It's a very good place to meditate, we found. There are usually people in it, quiet, sitting against the wall. This is a line of people going into the old dining hall for afternoon tea. And there they would sit in groups and have their chai and converse and have a little bit of time there. This is where, as I said before, we would meet people who wanted to meet with us. And so we'd meet there, have chai, and talk and answer their questions. This in the evening at 6 o'clock, then people gather and chant Ramana writings. And you see, this is typical of India with the women on one side and the men on another side. That's just a little bit of the flavor of Ramanashram. I wanted to give that to you. Now, I'm sorry, on to this week's reading from Ramana's Who Am I? We're on paragraph 41 now. These are Ramana's words. If the ego rises, all else will also rise. If it subsides, all else will also subside. The deeper the humility with which we conduct ourselves, the better it is for us. If only the mind is kept under control, what matters it where one may happen to be? This concludes Ramana's Who Am I? I'm not going to give you a summary of this text. A summary just invites you to try to engage it with your mind and to understand it cognitively. This is not the way to go about taking this teaching into yourself. This is for you to discover within yourself. So inquire, who am I? Know yourself. Now, it all starts with the ego. With the ego, rises the body, mind, and world. One practice that some find useful is watching the ego rise when they awaken in the morning. This gives you special knowledge. You notice the world rise simultaneously as the ego rises. You can notice this. This noticing makes it easier to see that since the world starts with the ego, when the ego subsides, so will the world. You don't need to stop all thoughts you might have. You just need to stop one thought, the I thought. It is from the I thought that all the complex multiplicity springs. To quiet the ego forever, you need to know that it was never real to begin with. It's like a mask that covers your real self. When you know, really know, in the same way that you know that you exist, that you cannot possibly be an ego. You never were an ego. You never will be an ego. Then the ego no longer has any influence. You can remove the mask. You are free. So it is simple. Self-realization is so very close to the you, just one thought away. That one thought is the ego thought, the I thought. When this this is where all of the idea of separation comes from. When this idea goes, so does any sense of separation. Now, on to our videos for the week. First is Swami Sarvapriyanda, and his talk is the Vedantic understanding of the ego.
From the highest standpoint, from the Vedantic standpoint, I am not the ego. That's the first thing we must understand. That's the central point. Why am I so worried and concerned about the ego is because I think I am the ego. Who am I? I. The word I, that's who I am. But the ego is just a function of the mind. Abhiman atmika vritti, ahankara. That is abhiman atmika, which appropriates to itself all other functions of the mind and body. I am speaking. Speaking is happening in the body with the help of the mind. And what does the ego do? I am speaking. You see, I am listening. Listening is happening there. And what does the ego do? I am listening. It appropriates to itself. It steals something that does not belong to itself. You are not even the ego. Did you notice what I said? The little personality is a mask. What does the ego identify itself with? With the mind, with the body, with the story of your life. That's what the ego says it is. All of that is witnessed by the unchanging consciousness which you truly are. The moment we do that, we take a step back from the ego. Then the ego becomes an object like this. You're no longer afraid, you're no longer overprotective about the ego. The ego becomes much weaker. It relaxes its hold. Because of the reflection of consciousness in the mind. Now, the mind itself, here the author divides into two parts. One is ego. Right now, if you look into the mind, you will feel an I sense. I not in this. I as the vertical I. I am thinking, so that I. And the other part he divides and he calls it antakarana, the inner instrument. In traditional Vedanta, here he's doing something new. In traditional Vedanta, when we study the mind, we divide it into four parts. Mano, buddhi, chitta, ahankara. The mind itself, which thinks. Buddhi, intellect, which understands. Ego, which says I am thinking, I am listening. So I. And the memory, chitta, the storehouse of all memories and impressions. So four parts, traditional division. Mind, mind itself is divided into actually the mind, intellect, ego, and memory. Mana, buddhi, chitta, ahankara. In fact, some of you who chant the Nirvana Shatakam of Shankaracharya, you will see the first line of that. The first line of that beautiful hymn where he says, I am pure consciousness, I am of the nature of Shiva. The first line is very interesting. It says, Mano buddhi hankara chittani naham. I am not the mind, I am not the intellect, I am not the ego, I am not the memory. This is precisely who we normally think we are. The person, the little person, my memories. This ego shining in the light of reflected consciousness, this is the villain. We think we are that. Here I am, I use the word I for myself. Notice one thing. The seer and the seen are different. This book is the seen, it's different from you. The eyes are the seen, it's different from the mind. The mind is the seen. If you say the mind is different from me, the mind includes the ego. When I say I identify myself with that I. But let me ask you, do you experience the I? This is the crucial question. Do you experience your ego if you sit quietly and do you feel I? Do you feel that? All of us, when we look into the mind, do we feel the ego? Yeah, we can say I. With confidence, we can say, yes, I am sitting. Do I feel that? Yep. I am listening. Yes. So the ego is something that is experienced. If it is experienced, it is the seen. And you are the seer of the ego. Do you see where I'm going with this? The ego is the seen, and you are the seer of the ego. Otherwise, it wouldn't be experienced. If it is experienced, it's an object just like this. Even the ego, even the I is an object. I don't mean this I mean the vertical I. Even that is an object. You are not the ego. You are not the ego. The ego shines in your light. We get identified with the ego and we think we are the ego, and the rest of it flows immediately. The ego is identified with the mind, and the ego is identified with the body, and then we think we are the body and mind. This is how the mechanism works. And the whole purpose of Vedanta is to slice this connection between you and the ego. The ego can continue working. The mind will continue working. Memories, everything, body and mind will be perfect, continue working. And yet you will know that I use the body and mind. I am shining in the body and mind, but I am not the body and mind. So the whole strategy of Vedanta is to slice the connection, cut the connection, the apparent connection between you, the witness self, and the ego. Look again at the first line of Shankaracharya's beautiful hymn. I am not the mind, I am not the intellect, I am not the memory, I am not the ego. Mano buddhi ahankara chittani naham. I am not the ego. Do you see how apparently contradictory it is? When you say I am not the ego, you know what you're saying? You're saying I am not I. The ego is the I. It says I am not the mind, I am not the intellect, I am not the memory, I am not the ego. I am not I. How could that be true? It's true because mind, memory, intellect, ego, they are all objects. They are all experienced. If they are experienced, the simple direct fact, I experience them. Hence, I cannot be those things. They are things. Just like this thing. Just like this thing. So now, how do I slice the connection between myself and the ego? Verse 8. The connection between the ego and three things. We have ego connected to three things. One is consciousness, pure consciousness itself, the real you. The other one is the reflected consciousness in the mind. The ego always shines in the reflected consciousness. When you think right now, don't you feel I am aware? All the time you feel. The moment you think I, it's an aware I. It's a conscious I. It's an I shining in awareness. So the second thing with which the ego is connected is this reflected consciousness. And the third thing which with this the consciousness is connected, the ego is connected, is the body. Immediately when you say I, automatically it comes, I am this. So the ego, mentally draw a picture, ego, I, is connected with three things: reflected consciousness, body, pure consciousness. And how are these connections formed and how are they cut? What is our ultimate goal? To cut the connection between the I and the pure consciousness. So I is connected to reflected consciousness, to the body, and to pure consciousness. Let's explore these connections. What does it say? Sahajam karmajam bhranti janyam trividam. Trividam means three kinds of connections. Kramat means in sequence. The connection between the I, ego, and reflected consciousness is natural, sahajam. It's like a mirror and your reflected face. Imagine your face, this face is the original consciousness. The mirror is the ego. When you put the mirror in front of the face, what happens in the mirror? There is a reflected face, right? If you have a mirror in front of your face, there is a reflected face. And this reflected face and the mirror, what kind of relation do they have? This reflected face and the mirror, what kind of relation do they have? They have a natural relation. Moment there is a mirror, there will be a reflection, right? Moment there is a mirror, there will naturally be a reflection. Your face will be reflected in the mirror. This mirror example is very good. Why? Because the ego functions as a mirror, the mind itself functions as a mirror, and consciousness is reflected in the mirror. You see, the interesting thing is, when you hold a mirror in front of yourself, what you see is the mirror and what you see is your reflected face. The original face is not seen. Correct? Your original face is not seen directly. What you see is a reflection. The mind functions in that way. The ego functions in that way. It reflects consciousness. So the awareness that we feel right now is like the reflected face. It's a reflected consciousness. We experience a reflected consciousness. We do not see ourselves as the original consciousness. That's what's happening. So the first relationship is between the ego, which functions as a mirror, and the reflected consciousness, which is natural to the mirror. Moment there is a mirror, there's reflected consciousness. The second connection, what's the connection between the ego and the body? I am this body, this feeling. What's the connection? Karmajam, born of karma. Because of our past karma, we have this body. Each body is produced by our past karma. We had many bodies earlier, we lived many lives earlier. We are in this life now because of our past karma. As long as that portion of our past karma keeps on giving results, this body will continue. As long as this body continues, the ego will be connected to this body. You can't do anything about it. And as long as the body continues, this ego will be connected to the body. And the idea is, when the body dies, the subtle body, it transmigrates to other bodies, and then the ego will say, I am this body. This body is forgotten. It's burnt or cremated or buried or whatever. And then you say a new body, a baby is born, and you say, I am this. So the ego is always connected to the body by karma, by our past karma. We have two relations already. The ego is connected to consciousness naturally, one. Ego is connected to this body by past karma. These are not questions we are interested in. The real question we are interested in is, how is the ego connected to that witness self, the pure consciousness? And it comes here, the next one. That's an absolutely stunning point it makes. Bhranti janyam. There is no connection at all between you and the ego. It's incredible what it says. We think we are the ego. And here Vedanta says it has nothing to do with you. No more than the leaf shaking in the wind is you. It's something, it's an object. The ego is an object. Bhranti means error. The only connection between you and the ego is error. It's a confusion. It's a misunderstanding. It's error. There was this person who went to a Swami who lived in a cave. Give me freedom, this disciple said. And the Swami said, okay, you stay here. And they put him immediately on a schedule of duties. You clean the cave and you bring food from the village and you conduct the worship. So you have to become a disciple. Then you get the knowledge which gives you freedom. After a month of this, the disciple became irritated. He said, when are you going to give me freedom? If you don't give me freedom, I'm going to go to a different guru. Then the Swami thought, oh, I'm going to lose this disciple, so let me give him freedom. Come tomorrow, early in the morning, take a bath, fast, come with a pure mind, come in the morning, I'll give you freedom. So this disciple is excited at last. And he comes in the morning and he sees the guru in the early light of the morning. He has come out of the cave and there's a big old tree in front of the cave. And the Swami, the guru, is holding that cave and saying, give me freedom, free me, free me, free me. And the disciple said, Swami, just let go. Just let go. And the Swami turned to the disciple and said, precisely. Just let go. What's the tree which we are holding on to? It's this body mind. Most precisely, the precise point at which we are holding on is the ego. The ego will continue to exist, but what we are going to say is, I am not the ego. The ego is an instrument. The memory is an instrument. The intellect is an instrument. The mind is an instrument. The body is an instrument. It's not me. Bhranti janyam. And now we come to verse number 9. How do you cut this? How do you cut these relationships? Remember the three relationships. You, the ego, you right now. This ego is connected to body by karma. It's connected to the reflected consciousness naturally, like a mirror and reflection. And it's connected to pure consciousness by no connection at all, by foolishness. So how do you disconnect the pure consciousness from the ego? So how do you cut these three relationships? Verse number 9. Sambandhino sator nasti nivritti sahajasya tu karmakshayat prabodhacha nivartete kramadubhe. How do you cut these three relationships? You have to remember what the three relationships are, of course, and then you proceed to cut them. How do you cut them? As long as the two terms in a natural relationship, as long as the mirror is there, there will be a reflected face. True? As long as you have a mirror, your face will be reflected in it. As long as the ego is there, consciousness will be reflected in it. You can't cut it. It will be there. So imagine in deep sleep, for example, the ego does not function and you don't feel the reflected consciousness also. You don't feel aware. You don't feel, I am in deep sleep. No, nobody feels that. If you feel that, you are not in deep sleep. So as long as the ego is functioning, consciousness will be reflected there. So the first relationship cannot be cut. It's natural. The second relationship, ego and the body. Do you remember? I am this body. How is it cut? It's cut only by the exhaustion of karma. When the karma of this body goes, this body will age and die, and the ego will proceed to another body. So the relationship between the body and the ego is cut only when karma is exhausted. And you get, but karma is exhausted means only part of it. It will generate a new body. And then you have, the ego will be related to the new body. But the main point is the third relationship. How is this cut? And the answer is prabodhat, which means by awakening, by knowledge, by illumination, by enlightenment. Just by the knowledge that I am not the mirror, I am not the reflected face. How do you cut the relationship between your real face and the reflected face? This is a good question. How do you cut the relationship between your real face and the reflected face? Tell me. There's no relationship, yes. By knowledge, yes. You just know that it's not me. It looks like me. It looks just like me, but it's not me. It's a reflection. It's a part of the mirror. and it's not me. Just by that knowledge, you have cut the relationship between your real face and the reflected face, which looks exactly like a real face. In the same way, we cut the relationship between the ego and the reflected consciousness shining in it and ourselves, the witness consciousness, by knowledge. See, that which is generated by error can only be removed by knowledge. That which is generated by error, the classic example, a person is walking and sees a snake and thinks it's a snake and gets scared and comes close to it and sees it's a piece of rope. It's a classic example. Now, how do you correct that thing? That how do you drive away that snake? The false snake, not a real snake. How do you drive away the false snake? Do you chase it with a stick? No. All you need is knowledge that it's a rope. Then the false snake is gone. Here, all you need is knowledge that it's not me. Clearly, I am the witness. Why is it not me? Back to the first verse. Because it's an object. The ego is an object. The reflected consciousness shining in an ego is an object. It's not me. Practice seeing the ego as an object. Watch how it behaves. The moment you make the ego an object separate from you, automatically mind will be separate from you. Emotions and desires and miseries and impulses, all of them will be separate from you. You'll find the mind is much easier to control then. The mind is difficult to control because we think we are the mind. Unhappy? I am unhappy. Mind wants a cookie? I want a cookie. Uh-huh. Right? Everything that the mind does, does not want, likes, dislikes, all of those become my likes and dislikes. All of those become my agenda because I have embraced the mind and think it's me.
And now we will listen to Mooji. He talks about living without ego.
It's just coming up inside my heart to maybe share something. Because I see that during this time, sometimes even from the Sangha also, and people who have been in the spiritual path for some time, panic does come. Not as much as we hear generally speaking. I mean, people have concerns and so like that comes. But this one I wanted to talk about just generally speaking. For those of you who have a deep or an increasingly deepening attraction to self-discovery. And I've been asked, like, where are we going to if one becomes increasingly detached from the world, so to speak? And by the world, I'm not talking about the earth. You may have heard me say, there's only one earth, but there are billions of worlds. And by this, what I mean is a world is a psychological and emotional and personal creation in the mind. And we are largely living in our conditioned mind, leading the way very often. For many people, it is like that. Another illustration could be that, when we go to sleep and you have a dream, your dream is a very unique experience. Even if your most beloved was right next to you and you were having a tremendous dream, there's no way that you could plug in, even if if the technology was available, you couldn't plug in and experience that dream together in the same way that you experience it. Okay? Because our experiencing is subjective and very personal. And why I'm saying this is that our life in the waking state, the world is also very personally, subjectively perceived by each one. So we have a common misconception that we're all together having the same experience. We often talk like that when we say, but I want to give you this because it's really nice. Taste this, it's fantastic. You say, no, but you don't know how it will be experienced by someone else. So we still continue. And that's part of the big field of illusions and delusions that we live in largely. So when I say that we are becoming less and less attached to the worldly mind, which behaves sometimes as though it knows the truth, those who have gone beyond that, or are going beyond, and beyond, not beyond that way, but beyond this way, in the inner realization of the truth, are discovering something tremendous. What the mind can offer to us, all the adventures it can offer, yes, pleasures, but not happiness. You see, it can ask you, you can be offered a sense of resting, but not peace. The peace that I speak about is coming from the truth within you. The more you grasp of your true nature, the more you are living constantly in a field of peace and a calm mind. So I just wanted to say today that sometimes people wonder if you are somehow appearing to be retracting from the world, so to speak. It's not because it's evil and you're cynical about it, but that you are discovering a higher way of perceiving inside and coming to the truth of who and what we are internally, not just as body and body-mind, but even beyond mind. And people may say, oh, you speak about beyond mind. Mind is all I know. Well, mind is all you. Mind offers a kind of knowledge which is actually not as deep as you think. It is deep only in appearance. For depth, I don't even want to use the word deep. The truth is not deep. The truth is here. It is just not recognized. And for those who have come to a place of seeing, what is the life like of one who is dropping personal identity or going beyond, transcending the worldly pull that comes from the mind? What is the life like? Well, actually, it's very beautiful. It's beauty filled, full of beauty, and not fantasy, not projection, beautiful in the sense that one's mind becomes very tranquil, very calm, and peaceful, open, without fear, and loving. Loving. Not necessarily loving in the going around loving in this way. It might include that also, but no. Loving in the sense that there's the unity of the self, and it's not just personal. We have a sense of a personal self, but you also have a universal self, and your universal self is more true. We have a personal body, you have a universal body. In a way, you come to see that the whole of this world and universe is also the body of being. I know that might sound very strange right now, but it's such a beautiful discovering. And don't worry, it's not going to just crash in on you. We have to grow into that. And how? Well, the more deeply you want it or desire it, and you have to desire it intensely to reach this level of completeness. I think enough for the moment. Thank you.
And now Nome talks about egoless self.
that you should know yourself is the advice of all the wise. How can you know yourself when being is not an object? How can you not know yourself, your own being, which is consciousness, self-luminous? In his spiritual instruction, the Maharshi has pointed out, are there two selves that one should know or not know the other? Who is it that would wish to know the self? Or who is it that is subject to the illusion of ignorance and its consequent bondage, and who is desirous of liberation because he intuits it's his natural state? Without knowing yourself as you really are, what can really be known? If you treat the self as if it were an object, to be attained or lost, to enter into as if it were a state, or to depart from, as if you would come down from that state. To treat the self as if it were an object is delusive. The self signifies yourself. And all the teachings of the sages and scriptures that speak of the self, the absolute, are speaking of you in your real nature. What are you in your real nature? Your experience so-called, your knowledge so-called, of anything else depends upon the view of yourself, the definition of yourself. This is why Sri Bhagavan says in Saddarshanam, Truth Revealed, that it is only as long as the ego is taken to exist, there is the ego sense, will there be the threefold division of the universe, the individual, and the Supreme Self, or God. The three are not really three, he says. The division, the multiplicity, appears only so long as oneself is not known. The self, which is pure being, consciousness, bliss, is ever existent. It is non-dual, and it alone is. If that very same self is assumed to be, through the power of imagination, an individual entity or ego, then all illusion sprouts from there. Since it is illusion, it is not really existent, but it seems to be. If we want illusion to vanish and perceive reality in such a manner that reality comprehends itself, then we must know who we are. And how else to know who you are unless you question the very one that seems to be individualized even now? What is it that you refer to as I in yourself? What constitutes the self? Can it be the body? Can anything perceived through your senses be yourself? Can anything conceived in the mind be yourself? What is this seemingly individualized self? What marks off or defines its individuality? That is, what is it in itself? It is not so important what is appended to it by way of the form of definition, whether it be of the mind or the body or of something of the world. All those come after the notion I arises. Ask yourself, for whom is the experience of all these things? Who is it that lends a reality and identity to all these things? With the appearance of the individual, bondage is possible, suffering is possible. With the rise of the individual, the ego, dualism seems to be the case. Inquire within yourself and determine what this individual is, if he is. If you so inquire, you will find undivided being. And in that absolute undivided existence, which is birthless, formless, and deathless, which has no condition or division, you will know yourself. Not yourself will know another self. But this is knowledge in which being and knowing are identical. Not as one person knowing something else, but the innate existence knowing itself with its own light. For this existence, there is no beginning and no end. For this existence, there is nothing else whatsoever. No departing from itself, no returning to itself. From this undivided existence, or real self, comes all wisdom. Wisdom is really that knowledge which knows itself. Such knowledge is not an idea or set of ideas. How could you be an idea? Real knowledge is being, and is not lost or attained at any time. That knowledge constitutes self-realization. So self-realization is not an event in time. It is not more at one point and less at another. Ideas of gain and loss, exiting and returning, attaining and otherwise, can arise only after the notion of individuality is taken for granted. Likewise is it with every other duality and every doubt regarding the nature of the self. The one remedy for all such illusion is simply to inquire and know yourself. Then you find illusion to be rootless. Indeed, you find it to be beginningless. That is, it did not start. Who then is bound? There is no one bound. Who gets free? No one gets free. What was sought as liberation is your own nature. You do not have another nature. Nor is there anything else existing. So know yourself.
And now we will meditate for a little bit. Breathe in and out. Long, slow breaths. Notice the breath as it comes in, as it goes out. And just notice that you exist. You exist, and you know that you exist without thinking about it, without sensing it. You just know. And now inquire, investigate within yourself, within your actual experience. Who are you when you first wake up in the morning and the ego has not become active? Who are you in the gaps between ego identifications, like deep sleep, samadhi, or when unconscious? The ego is only there when we give it reality. From where does this sense of reality arise? What is the source of this reality? Who am I? What is the nature of my identity? All right, we'll close with a short chant. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om. Peace, peace, peace. If this satsang was of interest to you, I have more for you: a free book site, a YouTube site, and my blog. The URLs will be on the screen next. This is the conclusion of this series based on the Ramana Maharshi book, Who Am I? In 2 weeks, a new series will start, reviewing Ramana's own summary of his teaching, 40 verses on reality. Thank you. for letting me share this teaching with you.